I want to ask you a couple of quick questions. What do you think is the biggest historical lie that we've been sold as true?
Many historical lies exist.
List them for me in order from the biggest ones.
Nero comes to mind, for example, who was actually a good ruler. They've portrayed him as playing the liar while Rome burns and things like that. No, poor man. Richard the Lionheart, who was actually a real scoundrel. And then you have the Robin Hood movies like The Great and so on. Throughout history, we find this in all sorts of things. The 20th century is perhaps the time when propaganda and mass media were used to deceive people on a massive scale. And then major lies emerged throughout the 20th century. Look at what's happening with our civil war and Franco's own regime. Now there's a reinterpretation, and the media are being used to tell us things that those of us who lived through it know are lies, but there are very few of us left. I don't think anyone who lived through the war is still alive, so they can tell us whatever they want. World War II has probably been the topic that's been lied about the most, the one that's had the most garbage and intentional distortion poured onto it, and the world has been living off the lies of World War II to justify the world that came after. It might be the topic about which the most lies have been told.
I wanted to talk to you about that, and I want to connect it to Iran. Earlier you said that Iran was named that way out of sympathy with Hitler, land of the Aryans. I want you to elaborate a bit on that story and what role Nazi Germany played in the Middle East.
Well, there has been very strong sympathy for Germany in the Middle East.
Current Germany or Nazi Germany?
Germany as a state. Look, for example, in Damascus, there's the tomb of Saladin.
Saladin, the one who had the war with King Baldwin, right? I mean, Saladin, the one who reconquered Jerusalem from the Templars.
He expelled the Christians. Acre was the last city in the Near East. Christian, since the Crusades, which, by the way, the Crusades are another lie in history, not because they didn't exist or anything like that, but because the Crusades were not to recover the holy places, but rather to put an end to the Eastern churches, most likely. But Saladin, well, the great hero who was Kurdish, and unified a large part of that Islamic world, expelled the Christians. And he is a hero throughout the Middle East. The mausoleum, the sarcophagus of Saladin, Emperor Wilhelm had it made of marble, and that's how it was displayed. I'm not sure if Al-Sara destroyed it or something else, but that's how it was. You could see it, and I've been there. There was always very strong sympathy for Germany in the region. That was already the case under the Kaiser.
Emperor Wilhelm of Germany, right?
Yes.
Yes, he came before von Bismarck.
It's after... Post?
It's right after...
Right? After German unification, Wilhelm II is the one who gives away. Let's see.
I like history and understand some, but don't have it all connected.
Not about Germany either, but he always had a huge relationship in the Middle East. He is the one who builds or helps build a railway network in Iraq, for example. This is basically explained by the fact that the whole area was under British influence or control. Iraq had them in one way or another until the First World War. Lebanon, Syria, Germany, Jordan, Palestine, and Egypt itself in another way, under a mandate, were under British power. As always, Germany has been an enemy of Great Britain, so there was a great deal of sympathy and hopes of liberating this whole part of the world. In World War II, the Axis, both Italy in North Africa and Germany in the Middle East. Well, in all the countries, I think there wasn't a single country in the Middle East that didn't have demonstrations. There were demonstrations in favor of the Axis, and some tried to rise up. There were movements in all the countries, as I recall, from Oman to Turkey. It was incredible. In the case of Iran, there wasn't a direct relationship, but now we're getting into thorny issues, like the move towards socialism, which stirred up enormous sympathy. Hitler was on the cover of the biggest American magazine of the time in the 1930s, 33, 34, 35, up until 36, until the Berlin Olympics. Sympathy for Adolf Hitler spread all over the world, and in the Middle East as well. In that context, that's when in 1935 the name Persia was changed. In the course of all the stories about World War II, the Middle East is not mentioned. But there were battles, there was war. Syria rose up. Syria was under the French mandate, and it rose up. There were wars in Lebanon, and Iraq also rose up. They even sent, but what Germany sent, keep in mind we're talking about the year 41 in June, is when the offensive against the Soviet Union begins. Operation Barbarossa is June 22, 1941. So around that time, I think they sent 4 or 5 planes to Iraq. Germany, couldn't help. But there was, for example, an Arab Legion. There were volunteers. Keep in mind that Germany formed the largest volunteer army from outside the Reich. The Waffen-SS had up to 1 million volunteers, and part of those volunteers, a proportional part, came from the Islamic world. There were many from Bosnia, there were some from Iraq, there were even some from India, units within the Waffen-SS. Dressed in their jigs, there were very few of them, but they wore their turbans. Those from North Africa wore their fez with their own.
And did they enlist to fight for British colonialism?
Against the English and French oppression in that part of the Middle East, they hoped that with the Axis victory they would become independent, but it couldn't happen. Germany lost, and it wasn't possible.
All right. Look, I didn't know that part of history at all. That's why I'm here. All right. Perfect. Why do you think, what is the biggest lie about World War II that we've been sold? Because nowadays, when you start analyzing the lies they tell you about things you're seeing in 4K, you're watching them in high definition on camera, and they tell you, no, there's no genocide happening in Gaza. And you say, how is there not a genocide happening in Gaza? I'm not the typical leftist pro-Palestinian guy who's been brainwashed and goes out to protest. No, I analyze the circumstances, and based on what I see, I make a decision, and my judgment is what tells me if something is right or wrong. To this day, they deny that there's an attempt to ethnically cleanse Gaza, and I'm seeing it. There are videos of Israeli soldiers killing children, playing as snipers. What we're seeing in 4K is pretty disturbing. Anyone who wants to, who has eyes, can see it. This isn't about politics, it's about humanity. Who can prove they're not lying to me about what happened 80 years ago?
Well, the thing is, we've been lied to about what happened 80 years ago. To begin with, I don't know. There must be a lot of lies within that chapter we've known as the Second World War, from 39 to 45. I'm thinking about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Was it real? Of course, on December 7th, Japan bombed, but what they don't tell you is that Japan was under sanctions, completely surrounded. They were provoked, and the United States knew about the attack and withdrew their aircraft carriers, and what was bombed was just scrap they had there. They lied. It's been hidden from us that during World War II, England committed genocide in India, killing 7 million people.
7 million.
7 million people, and in Iran just as many, both ordered by Churchill. And today Churchill has a statue at the foot of Parliament in London, a truly despicable man if there ever was one. Many things are hidden from us and others are distorted. Perhaps one of the conclusions, one of the consequences of these lies, which would later be used as a justification for the existence of Israel, is the genocide of the Jews during World War II. Which is a lie. It's a lie to say that it's justified. It's a lie that the existence of Israel is justified by the genocide, because the idea of Israel is much older. It goes back to the 1920s. So even if there hadn't been a Second World War, Israel would have been established in the same way. But also the way, the manner, the forms, and all the details they've given us about the Holocaust are questionable. They're deeply questionable. But it would reinforce the narrative that the Jews needed a place to go. The attempts to place the Jews somewhere in the world, since there were many places that were considered, would have happened regardless of the Holocaust and the very existence of World War II. But to create the idea that the Holocaust was carried out, that those 6 million Jews were murdered in gas chambers on an industrial scale, would justify and reinforce the narratives that would lead to the existence of Israel. This historical fact has been distorted and lied about. Many Israeli historians and writers call into question the existence of the Holocaust in the way it has been explained to us.
Do you have an example? I'd like to check it first.
Refer to Finkelstein's book, The Holocaust Industry. It's
Rabbi Finkelstein, totally anti-Zionist.
He's anti-Zionist. I'm unsure if he's a rabbi.
I think he is a rabbi.
Well, that's even worse for him. Pero Why is it worse for him? He knows, I don't know, I'm not Jewish. The point is that many authors, Ilan Pape, a great Israeli author, Jewish, anti-Zionist, and many others, question whether the Holocaust happened that way and deeply criticize the benefits that the Holocaust has produced to justify the existence of Israel. This is a reality.
You know? Look, do you know what really blows my mind? That when someone wants to question any event in history, wants to question whether there was a Christian reconquest here, wants to question, I don't know, the civil war from both sides. No, there's only the narrative of historical memory. Everything is questionable, everything can be reviewed. But when it comes to this particular topic, watch out, there are prison sentences.
Of course.
Of course. That's why I'm suspicious and want to know more. Plus, I've done some research and found there have been many Jewish people
Yes.
committed to the truth, yes, who have said, hey, this doesn't add up for me.
Some things definitely don't add up.
Like what, for example?
Well, for example, the figure of 6 million. Today, referring to statistics from before World War II, the numbers don't add up between those supposed 6 million and the people who later left Europe. There are circumstances. But the main issue at this point is precisely that. All of history, since it is part of science, science is a unified whole, and history is a part of science, is subject to revision. It wouldn't be acceptable for them to tell us, no more research in physics, we've already done it, this is unchangeable. Well, let's see if Newton's principles and things like that still hold true. History is subject to revision, by definition. What we understand today as historical truth, earlier I said that Nero wasn't, well, maybe something will come up that proves that Nero obviously really was a horrible dictator who killed a lot of people and enjoyed it and so on. But up to today, what is known about Nero is that he regretted the first one, he regretted it, he said, I wish I had never learned to write when he signed the first death sentence, for example. Well, history is subject to revision, research must be allowed, but here's the thing, when it comes to World War II, specifically the Holocaust, those things are not open to revision, and here in Europe, it's even forbidden to question it. In Spain, it's not a crime, I'm sorry. Not to believe it or to question it. It was for a while because of the interference, because of the imposition of the 95 Code, but that was changed. What is a crime in Spain is to justify, boast about, or laugh at, or something like that, a Holocaust, they've even imposed that word, of a genocide. But not denying it or investigating it. And here in Europe, the investigation of this specific historical event, which is known as the Holocaust, has been prohibited. This is unacceptable. Any historical event can be investigated. And once a historical fact is established, Columbus arrived on October 12, 1492, on the island of Guernsey, that's it, period. You claim he arrived in Cyprus with a bottle of brandy? Prove it. But don't stop me from saying something silly. Nonsense can be refuted. You make a silly claim, and I counter it with documents and data, but banning discussion of a certain historical event already makes us suspicious of other things.
And besides, I think there is a contemporary genocide.
Many.
There's a genocide, but it's actually much worse. And it's the genocide perpetrated by the Bolsheviks, by the Bolshevik leadership in the gulags, and especially against Christian people.
Several genocides have been committed against Christians throughout history, and nobody has cared. They haven't been given that kind of attention. No movies have been made about them. They don't make a fuss about it day in and day out. You mentioned that genocide, but we could discuss the Armenian genocide by the Turks or other lesser-known genocides.
Were the Armenians Christians too?
Yes, Armenian Christians, of course. Armenia is the first Christian country in history with its own liturgy. It's an autocephalous church that has developed its own form of Christianity, entirely acceptable, of course. Absolutely nobody in the West knows about it. The Saipho genocide, which targeted Christians, Chaldeans, Armenians, and Syriac Orthodox, was carried out by the Turks and Kurdish Islamists. Well, people don't talk about those things because they don't want to know, because it's not interesting, because there's nothing to gain from it, because people don't like to talk about it. Because in the end we will find, earlier I mentioned 7 million in Iran and another 7 million elsewhere. That is documented. That is very well documented. The genocides, or the genocide committed by the United States in the Philippines, or, well, people aren't interested in knowing any of that, and in the end, we will come to a sad conclusion that the lives of some people are considered more valuable than those of others.
That is the conclusion we have reached today.
Sadly, that's the case because 7 million Iranians should be worth the same as 7 million people of another ethnicity, but it seems that's not the case.
I want to ask you a question. Where does the power of the narrative come from? Why do they control the narrative so much? Why are there so many movies talking about what the chosen people suffered during World War II, and yet so little is said about how the Bolsheviks devastated Christian Russia? Why does everyone know about World War II? It's something everyone has engraved in their minds, but not about Armenia? Why? Where does that narrative power come from? Where does that ability to control the world and the minds in it come from?
For me, there are two explanations. One, because there is a rather obvious hatred of Christianity. We constantly talk about jihadism, but we don't talk about the anti-Christian policies that are being developed on European soil, for example. There is obvious hatred of Christianity. And, on the other hand, the specific fact you're asking me about is that the media, audiovisual media and cinema have been in the hands of people who are interested in spreading that idea to justify the existence of Israel, to continue receiving compensation even today from Germany, for example, as reparations for that genocide. They benefit from repeatedly bringing it up and keeping people talking about it. People who don't know a thing about anything do know about the existence of the Jewish Holocaust, but they don't know about our genocides. They probably don't even know about Cantinflas. No matter what we talk about, they don't know anything.
I understand, Carlos. I want to ask you the last question to wrap up, the creation of Israel. Earlier, you stated that the creation of Israel was inevitable regardless of World War II. If the Axis had won, do you think Israel would have still been created? Hold on, though.
Yes, but not in Israel. Israel wouldn't have existed. There was a connection, and now someone will comment, pretending to be intellectual, about the link between the Third Reich and Zionist movements. They were real, but only to move them elsewhere.
Madagascar, right?
The Madagascar Plan.
They also discussed the Havara agreements, as I understand.
Yes. It even had some connection in Palestine, but it never would have been established in Palestine. No, because the support of that Arab Legion prevailed, the relationship that Adolf Hitler had with the Mufti of Jerusalem, and a series of other things would have made it impossible for the state of Israel as we know it to be established in Palestine. It would have been somewhere else in the world. There have been Jewish republics within the Soviet Union in East Asia, north of Mongolia, a very suitable place. This has existed, but not relocating a people 2,000 years later to a place that does not belong to them. Imagine if someone, some visionary, wanted to rebuild the Roman Empire. Well, something similar is what these people are supposedly demanding, with arguments as solid as God promised it to them. Anyway, it's unbelievable.
Absolutely. For a Christian person, obviously, who believes that God promised them that land, what would you say to them to convince them of the harm that the creation of Israel causes in that region and in the world in general?
Well, we've gone around several times on a very interesting point, which is that there are people who relate the biblical Israel to the current Israel. To those people, it must be said that the current Israel is not the biblical Israel. Making that connection is truly absurd, a delusion, and that's what we're witnessing today in Israel. Tell those people that one thing is the biblical Israel, the people of Israel, everything we know from the Old Testament, and another thing is the Zionist creation of a colonialist, ethnocentric idea. Everything that resulted from that, including the Zionist entity and the State of Israel, which are unrelated. And here we're not just talking about Jews and so on, we're talking about evangelicals. We're talking about those people who talk about Judeo-Christianity. I'm talking about all the people who, without any kind of criteria, associate biblical Israel with modern Israel. They have nothing to do with each other. In fact, many Jews are against what we now know as Israel. According to Judaism, the creation of Israel is even considered blasphemous as long as the Messiah hasn't arrived. It's truly blasphemy. But Zionism, which has nothing religious about it, and later used religion or other religions to do as it pleased, wanted the creation of an ethnocentric state that would be the aircraft carrier of the West in that part of the world. Israel's existence only brings misfortune. People often ask me about a solution, but I don't have one for the Middle East. God help me. But I certainly know one thing. Palestine may disappear. It's about to happen. Syria under Assad may disappear. Many things have disappeared, but the problem remains. Peace will only come to the Middle East when Israel disappears.
What solution do we offer its inhabitants?
They should go back to where they came from. They came from Poland, the United States, Russia, and Hungary. They should return home. Or they can stay if they want. But that can't be called Israel.